This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen starts the show by explaining changes for young farmers and ranchers using crop insurance, as well as provisions for certain cases of selling farmland. Jeff Whitworth, K-State crop entomologist, keeps the show rolling as he provides an update on the wheat curl mite, armyworm, false wireworm, and Hessian fly, which can impact wheat planting. Ending the show is part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, Phillip Lancaster, and Todd Gunderson as they discuss how backfat impacts bulls' breeding soundness exams. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Well, good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, today talking about a few different changes that have taken place, and the first one involving crop insurance, something that came out with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and what changed?
Well, of course, we got a lot of farm bill provisions in the OBA, and one of those has to do with crop insurance. And in fact, the one change with crop insurance has several changes in it. And these are enhancements, and it really has strengthened the safety net for farmers and ranchers with respect to what they've done, and particularly with respect to beginning farmers. And that is what I want to focus on for the time that we have today, is they've expanded the definition of a beginning farmer or a rancher from an individual who has not actively operated and managed a farm or ranch for more than 5 crop years to one who has not done so for more than 10 crop years. So that change alone will allow a greater number of newer producers to qualify for the special benefits and extends the duration that they can receive them. And the other change that was made, Shelby, was that beginning farmers and ranchers, while they already receive an additional 10 percentage points of premium subsidy on top of their buyout policies, in other words, that's the coverage above the catastrophic level, the OBA provides a higher tiered additional subsidy for the first 4 years. And so on top of that 10, you're going to get, as a beginning farmer or rancher, an additional 5 percentage points. So the total additional premium subsidy will be 15 percentage points for first 2 years. Year 3, you get an additional 3, so that's going to be a total of 13. Year 4, you get an additional 1, so it's additional 11 points. And then years 5 through 10, which you didn't get anything before, you don't have an additional subsidy, but now you get the base subsidy of 10 percentage points. So that's the existing beginning farmer or rancher benefit. Now that's in addition to the base premium subsidy that all producers receive. So it makes the total premium cost significantly lower, especially in the first 2 years.
So for those beginning farmers and ranchers, if they aged out for those 5 years, the 5-year period, can they re-up and become in that 10-year period?
Yeah, they can reapply to utilize the remaining years of their newly extended 10-year eligibility period. So they may have 5 years left, and may have 4 or 3 or 2 or 1. They can reapply.
What if for a beginning farmer and rancher who is working maybe with an older generation, does it work for them?
Well, here we've got a glitch, and this is not as a result of the statute. This is a result of the regulatory agency, the USDA's Risk Management Agency. That's the governmental body that's responsible for the overall financial stability and integrity of the federal crop insurance system. And so they manage and oversee the federal crop insurance program. Now, what they have is a rule that says that if you're farming in an entity, to qualify for the OBA's increased crop insurance premium subsidy under the Beginning Farmer or Rancher program, all substantial beneficial interest holders in that entity must qualify as a beginning farmer or rancher. And that means the way they define substantial beneficial interest holder is generally defined as someone with a 10% or more ownership interest in the entity. So if we're working an estate plan or a transition plan, succession plan, and we've got a son or daughter, for example, that would meet the definition of a beginning farmer or rancher, and they are brought in with mom and dad in the entity, and mom and dad have more than a 10% interest, any one of them that's not a beginning farmer or rancher has 10% or more, then the entire entity is disqualified. And so I give an example in one of the pieces that I wrote. I said Jason and his wife wife both qualify as beginning farmer and ranchers, and they form a corporation. And that corporation would qualify as a beginning farmer or rancher. But if Jason's father becomes a shareholder who's been farming for many years and is not a beginning farmer or rancher, then the corporation will not qualify as a beginning farmer or rancher if dad has a 10% or more interest in the corporation. So that we're going to have to pay attention to that when it comes to estate planning, transition, or succession planning. And it may cause faster transitions. It may cause separate operations for a period of time before a transition that can be made. It'll have some impacts on planning for some people.
And as we've seen that change with crop insurance, have we also seen a change when it comes to buying and selling farmland for farmers?
Well, the OBA did include a couple of new real estate-related provisions. One is a provision that is for FDIC-insured banks and some insurance companies that say, well, if you finance a loan, if you provide loan funds to a farmer to buy qualified real estate, and the real estate, well, not necessarily to buy, but where the real estate is the security for the loan, then if you meet all sorts of definitional conditions that I won't get into, then the lender can exclude 25% of the interest received on that loan. Now, they can't deduct 25% of the expenses they incurred to originate the loan, but they can deduct 25% of the interest income. That's designed to inject capital into the agricultural sector in the rural communities. So that's one real estate-related provision for agriculture in OBA. Another one is a provision that I'm the original drafter of. It's New Code Section 1062. Now, it did not. If people are upset about this provision, I'm telling you, it did not come out the way that I wrote it. It's different than the way that I wrote it, with only a few definitional provisions left the way I drafted it. But the original idea coming from Senator McConnell's office in Kentucky was that they wanted a provision that said if a farmer sells farmland to another farmer, then there's no gain, taxable gain on the sale. You can exclude all of the gain. It didn't come out that way. That's the way I drafted it and sent it in, but it did not get enacted that way. This is the way legislation gets made, and it's a rough process. So what happened here is we've got a provision here, and it can be useful, but what it says is if a farmer sells, and I'm condensing it down and skipping some of the technical definitions here, but if a farmer sells farmland to another farmer who agrees to farm it for 10 years, then the selling farmer can take the cash that he receives and make an election on the tax return to spread the net tax liability out over basically 3 years. You're going to report a fourth of it with the return in the year of sale, and then a fourth the next year, and a fourth the next year, and then the last fourth. So you're spreading out essentially over 4 tax returns, but 3 years. So that allows you to get all your money up front, unlike an installment land contract where you're just getting a part of the money each year. Here you get all your money up front, then you can elect to pay the net tax liability in 4 equal installments.
For the buying farmer, can they do anything on that land except farm it?
Well, if they do, then that triggers nasty recapture, and that's why there has to be a restrictive covenant put on the deed at the time the land transfers to make sure that buyer does continue in farming. And so there's that restrictive covenant on there, and there's penalties for violating that restrictive covenant. So what the extent of those penalties is left up to the Treasury to write regulations. And so we don't have the regulations yet, but we'll see what the Treasury does. My guess is they will mirror the recapture rules that are in 2032A of the code, but it'll have to be a little bit different, because here the party that's violating the covenant would be the buyer, not the seller. And that's a little bit different than when we're dealing with 2032A in a decedent's estate, where we have recapture triggered by something bad that the heirs of the decedent did. So it'll be interesting to see how the regs are written on that. I wouldn't mind taking a shot at writing the regs if they ask, but we'll see what happens.
Is there an impact on what calendar year or tax year these transactions are made in?
Well, that's another interesting question. I've received a number of emails with respect to that, and in my article I added this commentary in. This provision is effective for sales tax years beginning after July 4 of 2025. So for most people that are on the calendar year, that's going to be next year. So their first tax year beginning after July 4 of this year would start January 1 of next year. And so some have asked the question, well, can I change my tax year such that it begins, say, October 1 this year? That question has come up a lot. Can I run it from October 1 to September 30? Well, technically, the answer is yes. However, the practical effect of that is you're not going to be able to do that because you're going to have to show a good business reason for doing that. You have to file a form with the IRS seeking approval to change your tax year. And then you have to demonstrate that you have a good business reason other than just pure tax. And this one would probably not pass the sniff test that IRS would impose here as to, tell us why you are doing this. What's a good business reason? Maybe you could come up with a good business reason, say, to time your tax year with your harvest season, those types of things. But for all practical purposes, my answer to these questions has been no.
Roger, what impact do you see this having then on farmers and ranchers when it comes to buying and selling land?
On these two provisions, the one I didn't focus on too much, the lending provision by the banks, the ability to exclude 25% of the interest income, I don't think it's going to cause a drop in the interest rate that the banks will charge. This is not enough of an incentive to do that, and I've had some bankers confirm that my thought with me on that one. Maybe 20 basis points, those type things, but that's not enough to cause the interest rate to go down. It will incentivize getting capital into rural communities, but it won't cause the interest rate to go down. On this one, I think the restrictive covenant language is going to be enough of a disincentive. It may not be that much of a heavily utilized provision.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with another reminder around wheat planting and pests with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Sure, my pleasure. Anytime.
Jeff, we've talked about this a few times before, but you're still getting a lot of questions, so I wanted to bring it up once again. And what are you getting questions about?
Yes, that's right. I'm hoping that this is the last time this fall that we get to talk about these subjects, but we'll see. But it is very appropriate. Right now, it's second week in October, third week in October is the ideal time to plant wheat if you're trying to avoid pests. And that's my job, is to try and help people avoid pests. So if you haven't planted yet, great, good for you. But now's the time. The questions I'm getting, for the most part, we still have, last year we had a lot of problems with wheat streak mosaic, which is carried, vectored, whatever you want to call it, by little tiny mites called the wheat curl mites. And I'm getting a lot of calls about those as people get ready to plant. I'm also getting a lot of calls about the armyworms. As everybody knows, this year we've had really serious problems with fall armyworms and armyworms. So hopefully we can talk about that for the last time this year, and everybody gets their wheat planted and gets some moisture, and we'll be looking good. Anyway, the first question I always get, should I use an insecticide with my wheat seed during the treatment? Because just about everybody seems to be using fungicides, but insecticides are a little more of an option. Generally speaking, in the state of Kansas, we don't need wheat seed treated with an insecticide. The insecticides that we have don't work too well on wheat curl mites. So if you're worried about wheat curl mites or wheat streak mosaic, it's probably not going to help you with that. We've used insecticide seed treatments to keep aphids off plants in our mite colonies. So that should tell you that just doesn't affect the mites. So whether it's wintergreen mite, wheat curl mite, whatever it is, the insecticide seed treatments aren't going to help with the mite problem. The other one that I'm getting a lot of calls about, and rightly so, are armyworms. 2 weeks ago, I found a bunch of fall armyworm adults. Since then, I've not seen any small fall armyworm larvae. So the fall armyworm doesn't overwinter in Kansas. At least it hasn't, and I'm hoping it never does. But as of this point in time, I don't believe they overwinter in Kansas. So finding all the adults, I'm hoping they were triggered to go on their southern migration. As a lot of you know right now, monarchs are migrating through the state to their southern overwintering sites. I'm hoping probably the same is happening to the fall armyworm. But it remains to be seen. I have not found any small larval fall armyworms. Now, armyworms, that's a different story. The armyworm is a native insect to Kansas, so they're not going to go away. What happens is when it gets cold, and a lot of guys are saying, yeah, when it frosts, it's got to be colder than frost. It has to get down into the mid-20s, and that should trigger the fall armyworm to quit feeding and going into looking for or going into overwintering sites. So if you use an insecticide seed treatment for armyworms, it's not going to help you also. Insecticide seed treatments first came out, we collected all kinds of armyworms, brought them in and tried to feed them out on wheat, and insecticide-treated wheat seed in the greenhouse didn't seem to bother them at all. One of the curious things about in the early 20s when we had all these armyworm populations, about 80% of them were parasitized. So when we bring all these larvae in, and woolly bears also, when you see woolly bears crossing the road or crawling up and down your patio, a lot of those are parasitized, or they used to be. But my point is, we used to have a lot of natural control on these armyworms. In the last 2 or 3 years, I've not found one parasitized armyworm or woolly bear. So I don't know what's happened to the natural control organisms, but it used to help us. In the last couple of years, it has not. So all these armyworms, they're still out there. In the last week, I was finding relatively mature armyworm larvae. So this week, you probably won't find any. I'm guessing they were pupating and becoming adult moths, and they'll fly around for a week or so and lay eggs, and those eggs will hatch into small larvae. From what I've seen in the last 30 years, the armyworm overwinters as a mature larva or a larger larva. Now, I know the literature says they can overwinter in any stage, but all the ones I've ever found in the spring that successfully overwintered were larvae. So I'm guessing because of the timing and the biology of the insect, they're going to be feeding for the next. Well, these eggs should be hatching now or soon with the temperatures we're having. We're still having late summer, early fall temperatures. I'm assuming they're going to be feeding for another 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So as that wheat starts to come up, they're in the wheat, they're going to feed on that wheat. The trigger is the moth. The adult female is the moth. They're going to lay the eggs wherever there's greenery whenever the moth comes out and starts laying eggs. So if you plant your field this week and it doesn't come up for a couple of weeks and the moths come out next week, they're going to miss your field. They're not going to lay eggs in your field. So you shouldn't have a problem with armyworms feeding on it. So it's all about timing. Whether you apply an insecticide or whatever it is, it's all about timing. So right now, as far as I can tell from last week, and I haven't been out this week yet, but as far as I can tell from last week, the armyworm population will probably become small larvae in about 2 weeks. So keep that in mind when you plant. And again, insecticide seed treatments don't affect armyworms. So if your armyworms, if that's what you're worried about, the insecticides aren't going to help you. But if you do have a problem with armyworms in the wheat, you can always go over the top with a foliar insecticide, and that's probably, you spray a lot smaller area anyway and get good control if you get them while they're small. So get out and look, and when they're small, the larvae will cause little, pinprick holes in the leaves, or window painting, we call it. And a lot of growers, early on, they're out looking at their wheat. They're pretty good about picking up on that. Now, one caveat to that. We're also finding adult army cutworm moths right now. So they're coming back into the state from oversummering in California. They're laying eggs also, and they're going to lay eggs on anything that's green. So any wheat or alfalfa, that's what's vulnerable to armyworms or the army cutworms when the moths are out flying around. So what's the difference is the army cutworm, they're going to be there all winter. They're going to be feeding anytime the temperature's over 45 degrees. The armyworm won't. Once the armyworm decides or gets the idea that it needs to go into overwintering, they won't feed again. They'll be in an overwintering mode until next April or May or sometime like that. So if you have little worms in your alfalfa or your wheat, it's a good idea to try and identify them. Or, if you want to spray them, you can spray over the top, and they'll do a pretty good job of killing them while they're small. Otherwise, you want to make sure if it's a fall armyworm or the true armyworm. Armyworms are going to feed. You know what? I've seen them feeding until November. If we have a relatively warm fall, I've seen them cause problems in wheat up until November. The other question I get about armyworms on brome or on perennial grasses, if they're feeding, cause the loss of the stand. Can't answer that. The ones I've seen, they have not. But if you have a good stand, you have a good root system, it should just be like feeding or mowing over the top because they don't carry any diseases. They just eat the top growing portion, the green portion of the plant. So they shouldn't bother the stand unless they're feeding on it continuously all summer long, generation after generation, where it doesn't get a chance to, get any regrowth. But for the most part, they're just feeding on the top growth of the brome or the turf or whatever it is. They should not bother the stand or the health of the stand if it's a good stand, especially under good growing conditions. So those are the two main questions I get about armyworms, fall armyworms, army cutworms right now.
Are there any other pests you're receiving questions about?
Hessian flies, get some questions about those. Seed treatments do work. Insecticide seed treatments work well, but it's a matter of timing. Hessian flies can lay eggs in that wheat from now till December as long as there's some warm temperatures. And those insecticide seed treatments are only going to last 20 to 30 days. So we generally don't recommend insecticide seed treatments for insects or mites in Kansas, but that's kind of the situation. I have seen one field this year already that was planted early to wheat that was pretty much decimated by false wireworms. That's another wheat fall pest that we usually don't have a problem with, but it can. And again, it's not affected by seed treatments, wheat seed treatments either. So that's a matter of just planting late. Like I said, if it wasn't planted early, it would have missed the problem with the false wireworm, but they were planted because they're intending to graze it, and they got a pretty thin stand, have to go back and replant. So that's kind of the story right now as far as wheat planting. It's the ideal time as far as avoiding pests, because if you plant wheat now and we get some moisture and that wheat comes up and germinates in the next couple of weeks, hopefully we'll be out of the pest business for a little while at least.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure, anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, Todd Gunderson, and Phillip Lancaster.
Backfat and bull fertility. Specifically, we talk about sending bulls to bull tests. They go on bull tests, they gain weight. We want to see how well they perform. Sometimes those bulls may get a little bit overweight or not. And I've heard people say, well, if they get too fat, they're not going to do well on their BSE. There was actually a paper out of Georgia that explored that. Give us the brief overview of what they found in that work.
Yeah, so brief overview was they measured subcutaneous back fat with ultrasounds for these yearling bulls that were at bull test stations. And then they did the BSEs on these bulls a month after they did the ultrasound. And they found some very clear associations between the level of subcutaneous back fat and the probability that those bulls would not pass their BSE based on semen morphology. And so this was not surprising that they found this, but it was very well analyzed. The analysis is very clear. They showed a very clear relationship between the probability that a bull fails their BSE and the amount of subcutaneous back fat they have during that yearling development period. And the take home from this is, if we over-condition these bulls and get them into what I call show shape rather than working shape, we are not setting them up for success. And it can be a problem because it's hard sometimes not to do that, because those bulls that are the fattest, soggiest bulls that go through the cell ring are typically the ones that get the biggest biz. And so there's kind of a trade-off that exists there.
And just to give some numbers for perspective, they compared a group of bulls that had about a half an inch of back fat thickness, and they had about 10% of them that did not pass their BSE, as compared to one of the other groups the lowest group had about 0.2 or 0.4 of an inch of back fat, and they had about 3% of them that did not pass. So yes, higher not pass rate, but not the end of the world.
Right. It's not that they all failed, but that's a
sizable difference.
It's a sizable difference, and you put a lot of money into these guys. And it's kind of something that we've known for a long time, because one of the things that will cause the testicles to produce abnormal sperm is they're too hot. Sperm production is very temperature dependent, and it needs to be cooler, quite a bit cooler than core body temperature. That's why there's a number of cooling mechanisms associated with those testicles. One of them is kind of a radiator right at the top of the testicles, right at the kind of the neck of the scrotum, that cools the arterial blood before it goes to the testicles, so that the blood going to the testicles is cooler than the blood going to other organs. Well, radiators don't work well if you insulate them. And one of the places bulls will deposit fat is along that neck of the scrotum. And so basically these overfat bulls probably have some increased testicular temperature, which increases the number of abnormal sperm cells.
I just want to add real quick, too, because we talked just a few weeks ago on this podcast about the benefits of pre-weaning nutrition in bulls and how that can help bulls reach puberty sooner. And it can seem somewhat contradictory. So I want to be very clear that when we're talking about pre-weaning nutrition, we're talking about nutrition that's going to help those calves grow frame and mature sexually faster. That's a very different type of nutritional problem than once the bulls are weaned and they're in that yearling phase and we're adding a lot of energy. That's a different nutritional program. I think Phillip has something to say about that.
Well, I was going to ask in the paper, what percentage of the bulls were in that half an inch of back fat or above? Because half an inch of back fat, that's slaughter cattle ready. I mean, that's our target for marketing finished beef animals. And so an animal would get half an inch of back fat like that, they're at a body condition score of 8 or 9. And so it takes a lot of energy to especially get a bull there with his testosterone level. So I'm thinking so it was probably a small percent.
Yeah, well, it was 10% of the bulls.
Actually, they divided the population based on ranking of back fat. So the average of the top 10% of the population was a half an inch.
So they
didn't look at it the percent wise of that were above that. So I think you're absolutely right, and that's a great point. So you've got a lot of energy that goes into that.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.